And now we will move to the next panelist, and I think that we will take the questions after we finish the panel. Please, Brendan. Brendan Mackey. He is the co-chairman of the International Council of the Earth Charter. He has a PhD in tropical forest ecology and is Professor of Environmental Science at the Australian National University at Canberra. Please, Brendan.
Thank you, Alexander. Well, I've been asked to say a few words at the end of this session about what does the Earth Charter ethic, what can it bring to this climate change problem? And I want to answer this question by imagining what would happen if our national governments agreed to, or perhaps were forced to, or were mandated to use the Earth Charter in their negotiations. So as you all know, every year our national governments meet at an annual conference, and in between their negotiating teams are continuing these dialogues, and they're not making very good progress, are they? We're all a bit disappointed. And it's like there are blocks in the road, in the negotiating road, that the negotiators are falling over all the time. And actually I put it to you that a lot of those roadblocks are actually it's the ethical dimension of these issues that are tripping people over. So what I want to do is give you 5 examples of where, if our national governments were to make use of the Earth Charter, it could help unblock these ethical roadblocks that are getting in the way of reaching agreement on some of these key issues. And there's 5 of them, so I won't be long. Of course, I think we're getting hungry and looking forward to dinner. Is that right? Okay, no? There's 5. The first one, obviously, if our national governments had to look at the climate change negotiations through the lens of the Earth Charter, it would bring ethical issues to the foreground. At the moment, they're there, but they're at the background. They're secondary or third order issues. This would bring ethics to the front and centre stage, and as we heard this morning, ethics is about giving consideration to our moral duties and responsibilities to others, both individually and collectively. And moral responsibility is defined here by the consequences to others of our actions or inactions and the potential to harm others from what we fail to do. Well, the Earth Charter helps us answer the question of who constitute the others. At the moment, others is really defined by conventional notions of short-term national self-interest. But the Earth Charter has a very different definition of others. It's the community of life. We talk about it here, respect and care for the community of life. It's all people in all nations, not just our own. It's other species with whom we share the planet. And it's future generations, those to come. It's what the Earth Charter calls the greater community of life. And of course our governments, in order to meet the challenges of solving the climate change problem, this brings me to the second issue, it requires that governments, irrespective, if you like, of who they include in their definition of other or community, even if it's only their own citizens, solving the climate change problem requires that governments take action now, that we invest money now, we invest capital now, so that benefits can accrue to people in the future. Well, this is a novel situation, isn't it? It's a novel situation for governments. We're asking people alive today to carry the burden of the costs of addressing climate change, and really the benefits from that action will accrue to those in the future. And there are strong arguments against doing that, and we hear them all the time. It's argued that climate change science cannot predict with sufficient certainty what the future conditions will be. There are alternative plausible futures which are not so bad, and anyway, why don't we just wait a little bit longer? Now, the science here is very important, because scientific knowledge, climate change science, through the work of thousands of scientists over decades, which is brought together, consolidated and communicated to us through the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's helping us understand the future environmental impacts of our current actions, and it's telling us what we're doing to the Earth's climate system from our current patterns and modes of production, consumption and reproduction, and the potential harm to others in the future of what we're collectively to do or not to do. But if we're to really implement or act upon an ethic of responsibility, it actually requires that we cultivate an attitude that makes us sensitive to the consequences of what science predicts. And that's what we're currently missing. Science is giving us a very clear signal, overwhelming signal of the harm that's coming and that's certainly going to come to future generations from what we're currently doing in the climate system. But we're not responding to the consequences of what science predicts. So really, we have to, if you like, educate our souls, in a sense, to be willingness, or educate it to a willingness to let itself be affected by this understanding of the calamities that are projected to befall future generations. And this is really the first step that must be taken if the scientific long-term projections of future harm are to serve as some kind of prognosis by which we change our behaviour now. That is, if it's to serve as a motivation for practical political action to solve the climate change problem. And this attitude that we need to cultivate is really embodied in Earth Charter Principle 2A. Care for the community of life with understanding, compassion and love. And we heard about compassion this morning. In the absence of compassion, in the absence of a soul that's willing to allow itself to be affected, we will continue to turn a blind eye to what science is telling us. So that's the second, important message that the Earth Charter could bring to these negotiations. The third one is a more prosaic one, a more practical. Once motivation has taken root and practical political action is taken, then governments, they've agreed already on certain, and they're going to agree on more, on various policies and measures, actions that will be taken and implemented to mitigate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions to a safe level, and for adaptation, because we're already locked into a certain amount of unavoidable climate change, and we have to help people and even species adapt to the unavoidable consequences. But ironically, if you like, a lot of the policies and measures for mitigation and adaptation in turn can cause harm. Okay? So we have to be concerned about the ethical dimension of policies and measures for mitigation and adaptation. So again, the Earth Charter can be very helpful because we can use the Earth Charter principles to derive criteria that we can use to evaluate the ethics of the policies and measures. I just want to give two brief examples. One of the problems we've got is that the scientific uncertainty about future conditions is always very great, as I said. So at the moment, if you like, the benefit of doubt is always on the climate change science to prove that bad things are going to happen. The Earth Charter suggests that we reverse the onus of proof, and that's very interestingly placed in Principle 6A. Place the burden of proof on those who argue that a proposed activity will not cause significant harm and make the responsible parties liable for environmental harm. Now, if we were to do that, that would completely transform political negotiations about the climate change issue. The onus would be on proponents. The proponents would be on greenhouse gas emissions to prove, the burden of proof would be to put on them. The second example of again of how an Earth Charter principle could really transform our climate change debate is Earth Charter Principle 7D, which says internalise the full environmental and social costs of goods and services in the selling price and enable consumers to identify products that meet the highest social and environmental standards. Well, let's think of that in terms of the price of carbon. Okay, putting a price on carbon, be it through a tax or some kind of cap and trade system, if we were to fully internalise all the environmental and social costs of climate change harm, if we were to internalise those costs in the price of carbon. Carbon currently sells, if you like, or trades, or the current market price of carbon is about $8 to $15 a tonne. Okay? There's been some economic analysis recently which points to or estimates that if you fully internalise the environmental and social costs of carbon pollution in accordance with Principle 7A, guess what number you get? You don't get $5 to $15 per tonne, you get between $2,000 to $5,000 per tonne. Okay? This would have a very, very big impact on a lot of things to do with climate change. There's two more that I'll just end with, two more ways in which the Earth Charter I think can help the climate change negotiations. One is the principles themselves can serve as a source of paralegal principles for advancing what is now being called Earth jurisprudence. As I mentioned, one of the limitations we're seeing in the climate change treaty negotiations is the limitations of all our multilateral environmental and sustainable development negotiations. It's the conventional notions of the morality of states, where nations' responsibilities are limited to conventional notions of national self-interest, securing their borders from invasion and honouring contractual obligations so that trade and economic activity can occur. Ethical considerations do enter international negotiations, but history dictates their influence is always constrained by what Hobbes calls the principle of war readiness, the ever-present possibility of war. So the conventional view of the morality of states accept ethics as part of the international relationships, but only up to the point where it does not serve national self-interest, only up to the point where it's not convenient. And as we know, the climate change issue is not very convenient. So new legal principles are needed to take us forward to advance Earth jurisprudence, and the Earth Charter principles provide some very interesting ones that again would help transform Earth jurisprudence. If we were to start to talk about a legal principle of global ecological integrity and to talk about as a legal principle the interdependence of the community of life, we would get a very different kind of law. We would get a more natural law rather than a kind of reductionist, positivist law. And finally, I think the Earth Charter makes clear what a number of our speakers have referred to, that climate change is not the problem. Rather, it's a symptom of a much larger and deeper problem, a fundamental lack in the sustainability of the human endeavour upon this planet. So the root causes of the climate change problem cannot be fully addressed by the UN Framework Convention on the Climate Change, and neither can the solutions. If we really want to address the root causes of the climate change problem, we really should be talking to the Commission on Sustainable Development, right? Because it's sustainable development that's addressing the root causes of the climate change problem. So there are 5 ways, I think, that the Earth Charter very concretely could help transform our climate change negotiations and help hasten the kind of outcomes we're looking for if we were to mandate that our governments were to make use of it in their negotiations. Thank you.